Traditional values can often bring a family closer and make its bonds stronger, but only when they do not turn into constant tyranny and total control. Today's story is about traditions that led to one person being killed in order to save several lives. Akyad Sulaev was born in Chechnya. He grew up in a conservative family whose worldview was based on traditional values and the beliefs typical of that region. Everyone lived under fairly strict conditions. His father kept everyone under iron control and demanded unconditional obedience. This applied primarily to women. The boys were punished less often. Physical violence was always considered normal. The father was the head of the family and provided for everyone, while Akyad's mother took care of the children. The woman lived in an atmosphere of control. At the slightest act of disobedience, her husband punished her quite harshly. The protagonist of this story observed all of this from an early age and therefore considered it normal. The Sulaev family had many children. However, the father's income alone was not enough to feed everyone, so they lived quite modestly. From a young age, Akyad thought about moving to another country. He chose Italy because it was possible to flee there through humanitarian corridors. The man had not received a proper education, but he had practiced sports from an early age, which allowed him to work as a karate and boxing trainer. He was tall, athletic, and had even completed military training. Even before moving to Italy, he found a woman named Natalia, with whom he started a family. By 2005, he already had 4 children. Finally, the opportunity to move appeared. Together with his wife, his sons, and his 2 daughters, he arrived in the small town of Nizza Monferrato, in the province of Asti, Italy, which had about 10,000 residents. The couple moved into an apartment building. Natalia immediately found work at a local hotel. She worked as a dishwasher. Following the example of his father, Akyad was also very demanding and quite cruel toward all members of his family. However, he punished his sons only when they got into trouble. His wife and his eldest daughter, Makka, on the other hand, were completely controlled by him. Akyad also began working, but because of his lack of education, he could only count on poorly paid jobs. Despite his experience as a trainer, he had no opportunity to return to his old hobbies. He was constantly looking for a better job in order to support his large family. While Natalia and Makka integrated into the local community, the head of the family did not even manage to learn Italian properly. Because of the language barrier and his difficult character, it was hard for him to keep a job. He often changed workplaces, which only made life more difficult for everyone. At times, it seemed as though everything rested entirely on Natalia's shoulders. Despite moving to Europe and living among the traditions of another country, the father of the family held on to his conservative views in his new home as well. Following his own father's example, he also strictly controlled the women, especially his wife and daughters. Makka Sulaev had faced her father's cruelty since her earliest years in Chechnya. She lived in an atmosphere of excessive control and watched as Akyad constantly terrorized her mother. After the move, however, the situation improved somewhat. The control remained just as brutal and total, but incidents of physical violence became slightly less frequent. Akyad probably understood that Italy had different traditions and that his behavior could lead to problems with the law. Still, impunity never benefits brutal people. Makka watched her father's aggression and always wanted to protect her mother, but because she was still young, she could not do it. The girl had to endure it and simply watch how cruel her father could be. Not only was she unable to stop his behavior, but as she grew older, her father began beating her in the same way he beat her mother. This became especially clear when Makka turned 16. After the move to Italy, she was frightened and depressed, but she had become so used to that atmosphere that it seemed normal to her. In Chechnya, it had been like that everywhere around her, but in Italy, the girl began attending a local school, quickly found common ground with other teenagers, and saw a different side of life. Her Italian friends, with whom she began to talk, described a completely different life, one that had nothing to do with what Makka's family was going through. The teenager began to understand that life could be completely different, far from her father's terror and cruelty. However, she found no understanding at home, and she did not dare complain to her friends. Only when Makka took a part-time job at the same hotel where her mother, Natalia, worked, did one of the managers notice the marks left by the beatings. Later, Makka developed a friendly relationship with this woman. She was the only one who knew the real situation inside the Sulaev family. Both Makka and Natalia received sympathy and support from her. In reality, however, Makka wanted to save herself and her mother from the attacks of her aggressive father. The girl understood that she could not physically oppose him. He was a tall, athletic man who was still full of strength. To suppress any resistance in his family, one blow from him was enough. He criticized everything and focused on every little detail. Whether it was dust on a windowsill or an item of clothing that had not been put away. It did not matter to him that the clothing might have been placed there only a moment earlier. It seemed as though Akyad was simply looking for a reason to complain and provoke conflict. His behavior became even worse because of financial problems, since life after the move was not easy for him either. Because of his low level of education, he could not count on a well-paid job, and therefore took work as a laborer. Even after years, he still spoke the language very poorly, which did not help him either. There was little work available. The money was barely enough to cover the family's basic needs, and the situation did not change. Meanwhile, the children were growing, and their needs were becoming greater. Against this background, the conflicts only became more severe. For a long time, Natalia could not stand up to Akyad. At the slightest disobedience, he would pull her by the hair. Very often, he called his sons to watch these scenes, while he beat his wife, and sometimes his daughter as well. He told his children that this was how women had to be treated. In his view, they were on the same level as animals, and therefore had to obey without question. If something did not suit him, physical violence was completely acceptable. The man knew exactly how to hit without leaving bruises. For that reason, Makka's mother could not turn to law enforcement. Because he felt unpunished, he became even more vicious. At the end of 2023, the situation spiraled out of control. This time, Akyad threatened violence for the first time and beat his wife very severely. The woman went to the police and stated that her husband had attacked and threatened her. However, when the Carabinieri arrived, no one could prove anything. Natalia could not confirm it physically because he had left no bruises on her body. Makka stood by her mother. The girl told the Carabinieri that her father had punched her in the stomach. That was his favorite method. He knew how to strike in a way that took a person's breath away without leaving visible marks, and afterward, he would brutally pull them by the hair. Usually, in such moments, the woman would curl up on the floor while the father told his sons that this was the only correct way to discipline a wife. Despite the daughter's support, the officers did not believe the woman. Feeling safe from punishment, the tyrant became even harsher at home. Makka spoke with her mother many times and tried to convince her to leave Akiad. But he had frightened the woman so deeply that she did not even dare think about it. After the last incident, when she had gone to the police, the man said that if something like that happened again, she would die. Makka saw her mother's critical situation, worried deeply about her, and believed that sooner or later Akiad would beat her to death, even if she did not turn to anyone for help. The girl felt powerless, but that only made her want to help her mother even more. March 1st, 2024, was an ordinary day for the Sulaev family. Makka went to school in the morning. Nothing suggested that disaster was coming. However, she would not have been the least bit surprised if her father started another argument during that time or after her return. In the afternoon, the girl received a disturbing message from her mother. Natalia asked her to take care of her brothers and sister if something happened to her. Since she had never made such requests before, Makka became frightened. She immediately asked to be excused, left class, and headed home. On the way home, she received a message from her father on Messenger. "When you come back, I will tear your head off." When the girl arrived home, she was met with an unpleasant sight. Her father was once again shouting at her mother. From the conversation, Makka understood that he had been fired again. This time, it was from the same hotel where he had worked with his wife and daughter. All of this had happened amid conflict, and afterward, out of pride, he demanded that his wife leave the hotel as well. He had even come to the workplace while Natalia was there, made a scene, but could not answer to the woman's simple question. What were they supposed to live on then? The woman refused to obey him. He left the hotel, but when Natalia came home, the conflict continued. The mother and father were screaming in the kitchen. Makka wanted to stop the man, but she could not gather the courage. He was furious again. The 18-year-old student knew that any attempt to resist could end badly for her. To avoid bloodshed, the girl went to her room. At that time, the other children in the family were also in their bedrooms. The argument continued, but she hoped her father would calm down and that everything would be over. In such moments, Makka often picked up her diary and wrote short notes in it. It helped distract her and calm her down a little. She did the same this time. But she had not even written a few lines when she heard the situation in the kitchen escalate sharply. Dull blows could be heard. Then she left her room and saw her father throw her mother to the floor and kick her. The daughter tried to stop him, and for the first time in her life, struck him with her fists. Akiad was so surprised that his daughter had raised her hand against him that he hesitated and froze for a moment. That allowed the girl's mother to get up. She continued, trying to calm her husband because she now feared that he would turn on her daughter. The man did exactly that and struck Makka. Natalia stepped in front of her to protect her. The man hit Natalia again, threw her to the floor, and began choking her. He shouted that he had such a daughter because of her rebellious mother. The situation immediately went out of control. Makka threw herself at her father again and tried to pull him away. But, of course, the slender young woman did not have enough strength to stand against a boxer with military experience. Still, she did not want to give up. The girl understood that her mother would eventually die if she did nothing. Makka took a large knife and stabbed her father in the back with all her strength. That instantly disoriented Akyad. He let go of his wife. Judging by the heavy bleeding, the wound was serious. Nevertheless, he got up, went to the front door, and locked it from the inside. It was obvious that the man was still dangerous and did not intend to stop. Akyad moved toward his daughter, but she attacked him again with the knife. The floor was covered in blood. After the second stab wound, the man became so weak that he fell to the floor. Natalia rushed to her daughter to help her. Makka threw the bloody knife onto the floor. She pressed herself against the wall and trembled as she watched in horror while her father bled out. The other children ran out of the room and gathered around their father. Natalia sent them back and called emergency services herself. The woman stated that her husband had tried to kill her, which was why her daughter had stabbed him several times in self-defense. Within minutes, Carabinieri and paramedics arrived at the house. The 50-year-old Akyad was seriously injured, barely breathing and lying on the floor. He had lost consciousness because of blood loss. The man was immediately taken to the nearest hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Akyad could not be saved. The later autopsy showed that the first injury had already been fatal. When the police arrived at the home, they found the girl in a state of shock. She was still standing with her back against the wall. When she saw the police officers, she immediately confessed that she had attacked the man with a knife and justified her actions as self-defense. According to the student, her father had first attacked her mother and then her, and had tried to strangle the woman, which forced her to attack him with a knife in order to stop the assault and save her mother's life. Natalia confirmed all of this. She showed the police officers several bruises and claimed that she had been beaten systematically. There could have been many more marks if Akyad had not known how to strike correctly. The most telling evidence was the marks on her neck left by the man's hands. Before going with the police officers to the station, Makka handed them her diary, in which she had described the constant beatings. The girl was convinced that it could be used to justify her actions. Makka insisted that she did not want to kill anyone. She only wanted to frighten him and stop him. She could no longer endure that nightmare in her home. The initial inspection of the apartment showed that the knife she had used did not come from the kitchen. During the investigation, it emerged that she had bought it herself at a supermarket shortly before the tragedy. Makka explained this by saying that her father was much taller and stronger than every other member of the family. For that reason, she believed that an ordinary knife would not be able to stop him. At the same time, she feared that an attack with a small knife would only make him even more enraged, and that he would leave neither her nor her mother alive. That was why she had bought a larger knife in advance as a precaution. The claim that the girl and her mother had been systematically beaten was also confirmed by her brothers and her younger sister. However, the fact that the girl had bought a large 30-centimeter knife for self-defense was interpreted by law enforcement as preparation for murder and as an intention to kill deliberately. The young woman's diaries were carefully examined. They contained numerous entries. She had recorded dozens of incidents of beatings against her mother and herself, accumulated over the years they had lived in Italy. The young woman claimed that everything had already begun in Chechnya. But those entries from her earlier diary had not survived because of the move. During an almost 12-hour interrogation, Makka Sulaev insisted that she did not want to kill anyone and tried to justify her actions as self-defense. At the same time, the girl regretted what she had done and admitted responsibility. The investigators continued collecting information, spoke with the family's closest circle, and with neighbors, but not everyone, confirmed that Akiad had terrorized his family. During the examination of digital storage devices, investigators found a message that Makka had received from her mother shortly before the tragedy. It did indeed sound alarming. In addition, all of this was confirmed by a message that Akiad himself had sent to one of his acquaintances. A few hours before his death, the head of the family said that he wanted to put on a concert. Witnesses from the Chechen community who knew the family and lived in the town confirmed that Akiad often used that phrase when describing dramatic events or scenes of violence that could cause a major reaction. These included cases such as murders and serious crimes. This indirectly confirmed Makka's statement. Natalia and Makka both felt that their lives were in danger. All family members willingly cooperated with the investigators. Natalia claimed that without her daughter, she certainly would not have survived that evening. The woman called Makka her savior and asked for leniency because, in her opinion, her daughter had no other choice but to stab her father with a knife in order to stop the beating. All of this was the result of exceeding the limits of self-defense. Interestingly, both Natalia and her daughter mourned Akiad's death. When investigators carefully examined the diaries, which listed numerous assaults committed by the man, they confirmed that the Sulaev family had been exposed to violence for years. The girl worried not only about herself and her mother, but also about her brothers. Akiad taught them to treat women in the same way his own father had taught him. The girl feared that they would grow into similar tyrants and would beat and oppress their wives and daughters. She understood that this was a feature of her people's culture, and she accepted her roots, but she could not understand the humiliation of women. Makka described in detail the difficulties she faced, especially her desire to answer back to her father. The problem, however, was that she was completely unable to do so. Physically, she had nothing with which to oppose a strong 50-year-old man, which is why she decided to buy a large knife. The purchase took place a few weeks before the tragedy. The reason was another argument. Akiad behaved so threateningly that the girl seriously feared for her mother's life and also for her own. Makka also described her attachment to her mother. According to her, Natalia was a very open and kind person, and Makka had a strong bond with her. The final entry in her diary stated that if someone found those notes, either she or her father would be dead. According to the girl, when she wrote that note, she was firmly determined to stop Akiad, but she did not seriously consider the idea of murder. The girl claimed that it had been written in a fit of anger. However, the fact that she used a knife she had prepared in advance was interpreted by law enforcement as intentional murder. Natalia and the lawyer pleaded for leniency from the beginning. They justified Makka's act as self-defense and as a necessity caused by her father's systematic tyranny. In support of this, family members described the peculiar educational measures the man used. He pulled his daughter and wife by the hair and always forced his sons to watch how women should be treated. Despite convincing evidence, Makka remained in prison after her arrest. The lawyer requested that the girl be placed under house arrest. The defense request was rejected. Natalia came every day to visit her daughter, but because of strict rules, she was not allowed in. The woman constantly asked how the girl was doing and what awaited her. At the same time, Makka also asked how her mother and the other family members were. Everyone was shocked that Akiad had died. Even Makka said that she had not expected such a turn of events. The moral questions in this case troubled the prosecution. Undoubtedly, the girl had killed a man, but the deceased had pushed her toward such actions through years of torment. Law enforcement officers collected information in order to develop the prosecution strategy. The facts were quite contradictory. The systematic beatings and humiliation Natalia described had not been officially documented anywhere. Many people in the family's immediate circle suspected nothing about the domestic violence. According to some statements, this was because sensitive issues were not made public, as well as because of the authorities' inaction after the first report. The woman worked as a dishwasher and had a lot to do, but even her colleagues suspected nothing of what was happening. The only person who knew was one of the hotel managers. Natalia herself never complained about her husband, instead attributing his behavior to cultural particularities. In her conversation with the police, she said that Akiad had mastered special techniques and knew where to strike so that no marks would remain. The woman even demonstrated his favorite grips. She also showed the carabinieri several barely visible bruises. The neighbors insisted that they had not heard screams or arguments, even though these had allegedly happened systematically for years. One woman admitted that she knew the Sulaev family, but said they had always been unsociable. They greeted each other briefly, perhaps exchanged a few words, but once they closed the door of their apartment behind them, no one heard any arguments. A friend with whom the whole family worked in a restaurant provided a great deal of valuable information. The woman knew that the reason for the final conflict in the family was Akiad's dismissal. He had quit that job a few days before the tragedy, and on the day of the killing he came and demanded that Natalia and Makka do the same. The mother knew that he had no new job lined up. She feared that she would not find a new position quickly. For that reason, she refused to obey her husband because doing so could have caused them serious financial harm. They would simply have had nothing to live on. The woman did not obey her husband and continued working. Only 3 days after the killing, she had to return to work. Now she had to keep herself and the family afloat alone. Natalia endured all these hardships stoically, but she continued to worry deeply about her eldest daughter, who was behind bars. The lawyer fought for a mild sentence. Although the girl was not released home, the defense attorney made every effort, while awaiting trial, to prove that she was an exemplary employee and student. Shortly before that, she had indeed begun college studies with excellent results. Everyone who knew Makka described her as positive, kind-hearted, and cheerful. Her classmates knew her as funny and friendly. No one suspected that behind the doors of her home there was constant violence, or that the student was capable of killing, even if for a specific reason. Everyone was convinced that Akiad's death was the result of excessive self-defense. The girl had only tried to save herself and her mother, which is why Makka received broad support. When the trial began, the lawyer described the life of the Sulaev family as full of suffering and humiliation. Akiad controlled his wife and eldest daughter and did not allow them to move anywhere without his permission. At the slightest disobedience, he punished them harshly, as if carrying out an exemplary sentence. Naturally, the defense continued to focus on the systematic terror. The lawyer insisted that all of this had been self-defense. He correctly emphasized that the girl had never had any violent episodes in her life. Even at school and in college, she had behaved very modestly and positively. The prosecution insisted that a single stab wound had already been fatal for Akiad, and that it had been completely sufficient to stop the attack. Therefore, the prosecutor interpreted the second stab wound as an intention to kill the man. The girl's actions were classified by the prosecution as intentional murder. Makka insisted that she did not want to kill her father, but only feared that her mother would die if she did not intervene. Even after the first stab, he did not stop and could have continued attacking, which is why she had to strike a second time. The prosecutor pointed out no formal complaints of domestic violence had been filed. This contradicted the story told by Natalia and Makka, who said they had turned to the police. However, law enforcement had done nothing to protect them. They did not consider turning to the police again because they feared Akiad's rage. An important role in the court's decision was played by a precedent from 2020 when a young man named Alex similarly tried to save his mother from his tyrannical father. He used a kitchen knife and stabbed the man 6 times. The father of that family also died, but the court of first instance decided that the young man had acted in order to survive. At first, he was sentenced to more than 6 years in prison, but then the Court of Appeal overturned the verdict and acquitted him. That decision caused a major public reaction. Taking that precedent into account, the defense requested Makka's complete acquittal. The lawyer relied on self-defense. However, this approach did not appear convincing to the judge. Even the prosecutor acknowledged the emotional and moral complexity of the case. Since the investigation confirmed the severe ordeals that the girl and her mother had gone through. At the end of his speech, however, the prosecutor emphasized that there was no other option, because responsibility for the killing could only be attributed to Makka. The prosecutor requested a prison sentence of 7 years for the girl, which was significantly below the maximum penalty for the charges brought. The court's decision surprised both the lawyer and the prosecution, because on May 8, 2025, the court found Makka Sulaev guilty and sentenced her to 9 years and 4 months of imprisonment. Intent as an aggravating circumstance was excluded. Mitigating circumstances were taken into account. Neither the reference to a precedent nor the convincing evidence that the man had truly posed a serious danger had any effect. However, the lawyer did not give up hope for a reduction of the sentence. He filed an appeal. Until then, the first instance verdict remained in force. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.